This is a 1/15 scale replica of the Back to the Future 1 DeLorean I bought 5 years ago. It no longer works, but when it did, it would have lights and sounds that would come on when you press down on this. Why am I showing this off? Well, reason being is because this top 10 video is all about the 80s. Things I think about when somebody mentions the 80s. Back to the Future and the DeLorean are two things that come to mind for me, but they're not part of my top 10. Now before I begin, I'd like to give a special shout out to 3 of my personal friends, as 2 of them are 80s babies and one was in his late teens, early 20s during the 80s. Mike LaFave, Don Armstrong, and Will D'Souza, you guys have inspired me to come up with this top 10 video, and it is dedicated to each of yous. So with all that being said, please enjoy the Film Freaks Top 10 Things I Think About When Somebody Mentions the 80s. Grab your leg warmers and your favorite mixtape as we take a trip back to the decade that was totally tubular. I thought maybe it would have started this time. Number 10, MTV. Before Beavis and Butthead, Jackass, Jersey Shore, and god-awful reality shows like 16 and Pregnant, MTV was known for one thing: music. Launched in August of 1981, MTV played nothing but music videos, interviews, and concert footage 24 hours a day. Nowadays, there's YouTube and Spotify for watching music videos, but if you want to see the new Van Halen, Madonna, Wham, or Michael Jackson video in the 80s, you watch them on MTV. Number 9, arcades. Arcades first popped up in the late 70s, but became the ultimate hangout spot for gamers in the 80s. Whether you went on a Friday night or Saturday afternoon, and with friends, family, or by yourself, you would go and play coin-operated games like pinball, air hockey, video games like Pac-Man, Frogger, Space Invaders, and many others, and you played these games either for amusement or skill by showing off and achieving the highest score. Number 8, hairstyles. Everything was big in the 80s, and by that, I'm talking hair. There have been many different hairstyles over the years, but none more crazy than in the 80s. Whether you rock big curls, mullets, side ponytails, or whatever, 80s hair was wild, cool, and defied the laws of gravity. You'd certainly stand out if you were caught rocking 80s hair today, but back then, everyone had something going and nobody cared how ridiculous your hair was. Number 7, Saturday morning cartoons. For any kid, Saturday mornings are the best. You'd wake up, have breakfast, sit in front of the TV and watch cartoons without a single care in the world. Saturday morning cartoons have been a staple since the 50s, but for 80s kids, the cartoons seem to be awesome. Besides reruns of Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera shows, there was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Real Ghostbusters, Masters of the Universe, Transformers, Thundercats, The Smurfs, Care Bears, you name it. Number 6, movies about Vietnam. The Vietnam War was one of the most brutal and deadliest moments in history, but nobody thought it would make for a great subject for Hollywood productions. I find there were a bunch of movies based on Vietnam that came out in the 80s, and though classic Nam flicks like The Green Berets, The Boys in Company C, The Deer Hunter, and Apocalypse Now came out in the 60s and 70s, the 80s gave moviegoers the first 2 Rambo movies, the Missing in Action trilogy, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill, Good Morning Vietnam, Casualties of War, and a few others. Number 5, movies about cops. Another thing I find the 80s had a lot of were movies about cops. Whether they were action films, comedies, or dramas, and the cops were portrayed as both good guys or bad guys, the 80s also gave moviegoers The Blues Brothers, 48 Hours, Beverly Hills Cop 1 and 2, the first 6 police academies, RoboCop, Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, The Naked Gun, and many others. Number 4, sitcoms about families. The 1980s were a golden era in terms of television sitcoms, and shows about families were also something there were a lot of. There was Family Ties, Who's the Boss, Growing Pains, The Cosby Show, Full House, Married with Children, Roseanne, and many others. And whether the families portrayed were both functional or dysfunctional, you felt like you were part of their household anytime you watched them, and probably still do. Number 3, the Walkman. First released in 1979, the Walkman would be a way to listen to music on the go in the 80s. Rather than being like Radio Raheem from Do the Right Thing and carrying a big, heavy boombox everywhere you went, the Walkman was lightweight, portable, and kept to yourself. Today, there's the smartphone, Spotify, and other music apps for listening to music on the go. But with the Walkman, you inserted a cassette tape of either your favorite band or artist, or a mixtape of all your favorite songs, and there you go, you're rockin'. Number 2, Nintendo. Nintendo games may be lackluster today, but back in the day, they were kick-ass. First dominating the arcade circuit with Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Mario Bros. In the early 80s, Nintendo will become a household name with the releases of the Game & Watch, NES, and Game Boy in the mid to late 80s. Almost every kid in the world had an NES and Game Boy, and games like Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, The Legend of Zelda, and Tetris would either make your childhood awesome or turn you into a raging bitter adult. Now before I get into my number one pick, here are a few honorable mentions. Terry Fox and the Marathon of Hope. From April 12th to September 1st, 1980, Terry Fox embarked on a cross-country run through Canada called the Marathon of Hope to raise money for cancer research. The death of John Lennon. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his Manhattan apartment by Mark Chapman. Lennon's death would send shockwaves around the world and resonate with so many people, even to this day. Live Aid. Live Aid was a benefit concert that took place on July 13, 1985 to raise funds for relief of the Ethiopian famine. Taking place at both Wembley Stadium in London and John F. Kennedy Stadium in Philadelphia, Live Aid would feature memorable performances from Queen, Elton John, The Who, Elvis Costello, and Phil Collins. The Rogers Centre. Formerly known as the Sky Dome, the Rogers Centre opened on June 3, 1989 in Toronto. It would become the home of the Toronto Blue Jays and another great venue for concerts and live events. And the number one thing I think about? The fall of the Berlin Wall. No greater event took place in the 1980s than the fall of the Berlin Wall. Built in 1961 by the communist government of East Berlin, the Berlin Wall was a guarded concrete barrier that separated East and West Berlin during the Cold War. On November 9, 1989, the wall came down to mark the start of the fall of communism in East and Central Europe and the end of the Cold War. Though it's still uncertain if it was Reagan, the Russian government, or Stallone's speech at the end of Rocky IV that was responsible for the Cold War ending, talking to my friend Will, he said watching that wall come down was a huge relief because North America was no longer under the threat of nuclear warfare, and I'm sure everyone else felt the same way. A fantastic way to also end the decade, the fall of the Berlin Wall always comes to mind for me when somebody mentions the 80s. And that concludes my top 10. What do you think about when somebody mentions the 80s? Hit me up in the comment section below, and while you're at it, like and subscribe if you're digging my new content, every bit of support helps, and follow me on Instagram at FilmFreakProd for all the latest posts and updates. Thank you so much again for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.